from a range of different backgrounds, thank you, from a number of different backgrounds, exploring how the kind of ethical framework could be applied to different contexts of coercive confinement. And we selected a small number of these papers, looking for ones which could collectively play a part in expanding the conversation about what morality means under a range of different conditions of coercive confinement. So we're looking for geographic breadth, disciplinary breadth, breadth of focus, breadth as much as possible of institution. I think probably because of mine and Ryan's networks, the majority of the contributions are from prisons. But we do also look beyond them into nursing homes, post-release spaces, and spaces like death row. We met in Cambridge in summer 2022. We presented our works in progress there, and we worked on them in the meantime, and they have been coming out over the last year or so and are finally finalised and launched today. And most of what we're going to talk about in this session is these papers individually. And we think they all make fantastic individual contributions to the field, and they all kind of stand alone. But we also think that they collectively say something or have a few kind of core contributions to the discipline. They bring in frameworks and concepts in ways which we think are valuable to the study of coercive confinement. So before hearing from the speakers, I thought it might be nice for Ryan and I to highlight the three core contributions that we think that they make. So the first is, I think, that these papers collectively decenter or rejig our focus on power. So most prison sociology, most studies of coercive confinement focus primarily on how individuals act and interact with the institution. So their core concepts are things like compliance, resistance, order, disorder, all of which primarily see people as an object in a centre, or can see people as an object in a centre of power relations. They privilege how the individual interacts with the institution. But thinking about people as ethical actors, as moral actors, brings in a broader sense of personhood and offers new concepts and frameworks, whether becoming or whether the development of virtues, which helps us think about how selves are formed within institutions, how people try to become who they are within institutions, but not in a way which is necessarily primarily shaped by or against these institutions. So that, I think, is one contribution that this framework can make.
And I think it also encourages us to see the institutions of coercive confinement as less morally totalizing and fixed as we often see that they are. We see that this perspective allows us to see some fluidity around those and also some agency, especially as people inhabiting these worlds, whether they be staff or prisoners or others, as they come to engage with these codes and these norms within that. And we're really interested in how it is that people navigate and negotiate those norms.
And finally, we also think that this framework kind of brings the institutional frameworks, these institutional norms, into the frame itself. So it highlights that institutions of coercive confinement are these moral assemblages, that they bring together multiple different discourses, embodied moralities, dispositional moralities, and so on, and gives us the tools to make these moral assemblages targets of study in themselves. So why does this particular institution promote or try to promote the forms of morality that it does? What counts as good or bad here, and why? And seeing them as tools of study in themselves, again, kind of helps us to see them as both less fixed, as less total, as less totalizing, and as something that we can increasingly question. So we hope that the overall perspective is interesting and useful to those of you who are here. But what is most useful is the individual papers. So now we're going to hear from our speakers in turn. So you have, as I think I said before, kind of 3 to 5 minutes-ish. Ideally no more than 5, so we've got time to hear everyone, and it's totally fine if it's briefer than that. We're going to start by hearing from Julienne Vagels, who's going to be talking about her paper, Between State Theatres and Prisoner Performances of Change, Nicaragua's Contested Moral Politics of Incarceration.
Yes, thank you, Alice and Ryan, for organizing this. And I will stick to the time because I just taught for 4 hours, so I wrote out what I will present. So my contribution, I think, lies quite squarely within the third element that Alice just mentioned, in the sense of clarifying how institutional norms act and studying them, let's say, in and of themselves, and how they also interact with what prisoners feel, want, and do. So in Nicaragua, the national penitentiary law holds that the primordial goal of imprisonment is penal re-education of incarcerated people, and constituting the institutional vehicle for so-called change of attitude. This political and moral framework shapes not only how re-education is enacted inside its walls, but also who is considered deserving of the benefits that it has become infused with. Benefits that are not only moral benefits, as in becoming a changed man, but also political benefits like early release. So at the hand of, and this in and of itself spurs, of course, a performative battle between prisoners and authorities about who is doing it, quote unquote, right. And at the hand of long-term ethnographic research that I've conducted with formerly incarcerated people, the article seeks to elucidate not only the ways in which multiple moral orders can coexist and also vie with each other, but also how morality and legitimacy are co-constituted. And the article is divided into 5 sections. So in order to address fully both the role of politics and morality in institutional environments, I first expand on Zygot's, so Zygon, who was just mentioned already by Alice and Ryan, on his tripartite definition of moral assemblages in institutional environments, relating it to discussions on institutional ordering and legitimacy. Right? So combining these literatures essentially in order to be able to combine also the political with the moral and to understand how the moral and the political are co-constituted. And then I present 3 empirical sections, of course, after the methods. So the first one discusses the emergence of Nicaragua's current prison system's institutional moral framework, elucidating how its penal re-education model is historically embedded in the development of the Sandinista party state. And in so doing, I consider the role of broader public and political discourses around crime control, which have influenced the trajectory of its institutional ideology from a popular socialist to a more socially conservative moral paradigm and practice. And moving into the prison in the second section, I focus on the ethical practices of incarcerated young men, particularly through a theater in prison initiative, which is also why the title is called State Theaters and Prisoner Performances of Change, as they struggle for moral recognition, right, from the institution, and explaining how prisoners both subscribe to and contest the authorities' paradigm, explore their embodied moral dispositions through their attempts to forward their own understandings and practices of the required change of attitude within the prison theater program. And finally, I turn to political imprisonment. So as the institution's political moral framework has become magnified with the reemergence of political imprisonment in Nicaragua since 2018, political prisoners have become paradoxically both excluded from participation in re-education, while at the same time, they're the key object of political and moral work of the regime at large, right? So calling into question the current Sandinista state legitimacy and their moral authority, political prisoners attempt to disrupt and force the institution to its own moral breakdown. So I try to expand this notion of moral breakdown or ethical breakdown, which is often considered at an individual level, to see how that might be collectivized. So how moral breakdowns can be collectivized, which might then lead, I hope, tentatively to political breakdown and vice versa, right? So is it possible that the seeds for institutional change could be planted in this way, kind of from the bottom up? So though I I kind of come to a conclusion that no, or not that no at all, but more that is very difficult. And so though the local moral assemblages are very malleable, or they have proven to be very malleable, this political moral work from below is severely limited by the disproportionate amount of coercive power amassed above, right? That is by a system of power holders who have radicalized their political and moral values, investing in the maintenance of their political position at all costs. And as a result, the Nicaraguan case, I feel, points to both possibilities and severe limitations for moral and institutional change under autocratic rule. And I hope I stayed within the 3 to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Sid. Thank you, Julianne. And now we'll hear from Ryan Williams, who's going to be talking about his article within this contribution, within this themed issue, which is called Prisoner Morality Beyond the Inmate Code, Being a Working Class Muslim Stuck in an English High Security Prison.
Thank you. So yes, this whole article is really based upon one prisoner named, who I call Raz, who is really quite an intriguing figure. So this is based on field work from 2017 in a high security prison, as the title says. He was very interesting because he was serving a short-term sentence in a long-term prison. And you always know during field work when you come across someone who just is kind of new and fresh, and they see the prison and they describe the prison with those eyes as well. And so I was able to see the prison anew through his eyes. And there's always a bit of risk with doing an article around a sample of one, but which is really important for what we do in this special issue, in this themed issue, is that even though it is just a single case study, we do recognize that the approach within the anthropology of morality and ethics, within this ethical turn, it recognizes that subjects, or the people that we speak to, are already experiencing agents, and they're already relational beings, and they're also products of particular social and discursive histories, and that's really important. And so when we speak to a person, we're actually speaking to the moral world that they inhabit in its full 3 dimensions. And so even though I interviewed more than one person, but actually he deserved getting the focus of this for the reasons you'll find out in a few moments. But before turning to what I think is innovative or that's being benefited from what we're trying to do in this themed issue, what have I done that's quite familiar to prison sociologists? Well, first of all, there's definitely a criticism of Gresham Sykes's work, particularly how, as you know, Sykes showed how prisoners develop subcultural moralities to adapt to imprisonment, but we also know there's been lots written on him. Critics note that his work reflects perhaps a bygone era, that his work is often applied too universally to cross prisons, and obviously that he was quite blind to race. And I think that's where Raz comes in to inform a contemporary look at prisoner subcultures. And the second thing that was kind of familiar here is definitely the importation and deprivation models of prisoner subcultural moralities. You'll feel some of that in here as well, and those are obviously very useful analytical categories. But what I do think I do that's somewhat innovative, or at least what this framework does that's innovative, is that it recognizes that prisoners face multiple morality systems, as we've been discussing so far, and the prison life is not characterized by adherence to a single inmate code or by imported street codes. And so the analytical task that I really want to encourage from this work is to describe how prisoners deliberate upon, adopt, contest, or innovate around these systems and these moral worlds in which they inhabit. And that necessarily includes acknowledging these configurations of power in which they're embedded within coercive confinement. And so the article is broken down into 2 parts. The first part is really building again on this idea of moral assemblages, and I wanted to construct this moral world in which Raz inhabited. And there's kind of 3 components that I thought were informative to this world that he inhabited, distinct discourses. One of these was a racialized discourse around Muslims. This was a securitized discourse around Muslims and their risk to the prison, and that was a moral discourse that was a negative one that he had to navigate. A second one is of liberal multiculturalism, and specifically it's emancipatory, freeing, we'll say freeing, his freeing claims, emancipation, that's the word. Try that at midnight. I'll give you a prize for that one. So yeah, liberal multiculturalism offers promises. And so there's promises of liberation through freedom to practice your religion, but these practices didn't pan out very well for him. Thirdly, his codes were, or he was embedded within localized Muslim morality. And just very briefly, he actually abandoned each of these, and he found each of these to be hegemonic because they failed to provide the emancipation and the freedom that he wanted. And so that's the first half of it. Second half, I examined how he leaned on a street identity and how he uses to forge his own independent morality in connection with these systems. And just a quick snapshot here, his moral life was characterized quite uniquely compared to other interviewees. He told me how he was a cultural Muslim. He wasn't necessarily a pious Muslim. He told me he wanted to drink vodka with me. As you can see from the headings, he swore a lot. He also described to me how he taught his nephew how to box and how this was an avenue for dignity and how to cultivate survival skills in a discriminatory Britain. And so he was innovating around these moral sources to find his own kind of liberation within this coercive context. And overall, I just wanted this article to show how morality still animates prison social life and how the study of moral and ethical life provides a unique window into power and how power is experienced and negotiated.
Thanks, Ryan. Next up, we will hear from Julie Larson and Christian Bjorland talking about their article, The Absent Presence of the Offence in Prisons in Norway and England and Wales.
Yes, thank you very much, Alice and Ryan. And we just want to start by briefly saying thank you all together. I think we agreed that I'll say a bit about our article and then Christian will skillfully answer any questions people might have. But we wanted to say we gained so much from joining the themed issue all together. We had unusually helpful and encouraging feedback in the workshop. We listened to very exciting presentations and had conversations with fellow authors. And of course, we had very rigorous peer review by Alice and Ryan, which was altogether very helpful. And we begin our article with a quote from our interviewee called Peter, who said, "There should be someone who meets people in the prison and asks them, 'Why do you feel that you are here?'" And we were really intrigued by that statement. He seemed to expect that the prison should fix or at least address or acknowledge what he felt was maybe a moral faultiness through dialogue and collaboration in ethical self-development. And he actually really welcomed the opportunity to sort of dive into moral and ethical questions. But he found a mostly empty moral space when he entered the prison. And we were really struck by this lack of any meaningful conversation about the offense in prisons generally. And that led us to examine what we ended up calling the absent presence of the offense in England and Wales and Norway. And our data is from a large comparative project on penal policymaking and prisoners' experiences, also called COMPEN, in which we interviewed people in prison in England and Wales and Norway, and we draw on 452 interviews from 13 different prisons for this article. And we found it so interesting that by nature of their imprisonment and conviction, you could say that prisoners are condemned, but at the same time, they're not directed or advised as to what this condemnation means or how to deal with it. And we think that the moral and ethical framework that Alice and Ryan proposed for this theme, but also in general, lends us a way of thinking about the offense in a way that felt more analytically fruitful and rich than, for example, more traditional hierarchical-based analysis of the meaning of the offense in prisons would enable us to do. And in the article, we argue that the prison or coercive confinement is a particular ethical world one in which the offense is both there and not there at the same time, which sometimes leaves a largely empty moral space, which some people ignore, or sometimes they succeed or fail to fill this space. And of course, and importantly, people in prisons have diverse and complex relationships with the offenses they have been convicted of. And we felt like the moral and ethical framework allowed us to understand these very different ethical projects, as we could call them. Although for those prisoners troubled by shame and guilt, as Peter was, the non-addressing of the offense was problematic. But there was another group of men and women in both England, Wales, and Norway who had no desire at all to talk about the offense, and they just wished to get on with it to serve their sentence. Some had already discussed it a lot. Some were very sort of settled on why they were in prison and how to avoid ending up in prison again, and they were sort of comfortable not talking about the offense. But what about the rest, you could say? So the article basically explores the ethical worlds of prisons by analyzing when and where the offense is present and absent. And we argue that prisons' ethical worlds are fragmented, they're disconnected from the past and the future, and they're often quite irrelevant to the present. This disconnection led to confusion for some interviewees, while others seem to accept or even approve of the fact that the offense is both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So we think that the anthropology of ethics allows us to describe how this absent presence of the offense can lead to confusion and misplaced shame. But at the same time, we also found that it fosters, or it can foster, positive relationships between the people who live and work in prisons. And we conclude by arguing that the types of moral concerns that some of our interviewees were preoccupied with did not match those of the institution. The institution's preoccupations were mostly about following rules. That was certainly more important than living right. In other words, we found that some of our interviewees were engaged in quite morally deep labor, but they did so within the confines of institutions with much shallower concerns. Ethical self-reflection in prison is, we think, or we argue, for the most part, a non-assisted project, which feels unproblematic and even desirable for some prisoners, while others struggle to make sense of their imprisonment if it does not address the reason why they're serving a sentence in the first place. I hope that was more or less on time.
Perfect in every way, Julie. Thank you very much. Next up, we will hear from Maitri Misra. Unfortunately, her co-author, Zeba Sakura, can't be here today for travel-related reasons, but Maitri will be talking about their paper, Living on Death Row in India, The Many Becomings.
Thanks, Alice and Ryan, for not just organizing this themed launch, but I must also acknowledge the immense help that both of you have been to Zeba and me in writing this paper and getting it out there. So thank you so much. Before I begin, I must also acknowledge that I have, while Zeba and I undertook this effort to do a paper on which reflects anthropology. I am a lawyer by training and I have no relation to anthropology as such, not at all before I started working on this paper. So any mistakes and poor interpretations of anthropological texts are for that reason. So I already apologize for that. In the paper that Zeba and I wrote for this edition, we tried to peep, so to say, into the internal lives of three death row prisoners. And we wanted to understand how those who are deemed ineligible for life navigate the moral worlds created by death row. Before getting into these three things and the analytical lens we adopt, a quick word about death row and death penalty in India is important. So, unlike many countries which retain the death penalty, in India, death row or people who are sentenced to death do not live in solitary confinements. They are situated very much within the chaos of the prison. Uh, the carceral culture in India is one of chaos, of whims and arbitrariness of prison officials, other inmates, overcrowding, hygiene, poor hygiene, and violence of all kinds. And it is within this that people sentenced to death live serve their time out. And as a legal punishment, death penalty has an interesting uh, contradiction. So while a person is sentenced to death, while they are told they are condemned to die, and the law mandates an end to their life, it simultaneously urges prisoners to reform. The this urge is the created because of a future promise of a reduction in sentence if the prisoner has reformed per the law's understanding. The other problem is that, well, it's not a problem, but the other concern and a divergence from a lot of the other retentionist countries is that executions are also rare in India. So it is very much possible that a person would be sentenced to death, live for years together on death row, contemplating their death, and may ultimately not get executed, may in fact also get released from prison. In the paper, we examine the lives of three prisoners who we call Purab, Drupad, and Datta. These are prisoners who are uh, men in their early 20s when they were charged with the offense, and have, at the point that we were talking to them, they had roughly spent around on an average 4 years on death row at this point, and they were in different sort of stages of the judicial journey of on the death penalty. We, in analyzing and looking at these lives, we use the lens of becoming, and we use Beale and Locke's understanding of Deleuze's is becoming to examine these lives. Uh, the reason we chose the lens of becoming was uh, its idea that people are always changing, moving, there is nothing static about people, to us as lawyers working on the death penalty seemed very closely aligned with the law on reformation, which reformation within the context of the death penalty, which also implicitly believes that people are capable of change and people do evolve. But when we started looking much more closely and much more granularly into this, into the lens of becoming as well as these lives, we realized that the law on reformation was severely failing to capture the uh, moral back and forth inherent in living, including in conditions of coercive confinement of death row. And the lens of becoming allowed us to, well, it revealed to us, even though we've met these people before and we've read these transcripts for ages, it revealed to us some very interesting insights about how people respond to and navigate the almost illegibility of the death penalty in India. Um, and we found that these three people were following very different trajectories. Purab, for instance, we found that though he was very openly dismissive and critical of the death penalty, the criminal justice system, the prison system, what was also coming out in the interview, when we started looking at it much more closely, was that Purab was also dealing with his own churning, which was brought on by having to finally coming to terms with the offense he had done. He was charged for murder of three people. Um, and so, hidden beneath and under the very obvious critical stance that Purab had was this inner storm that he was dealing with. With Drupad, he was sentenced to death for the rape and murder of a minor girl. Uh, his resistance, his life on death row, and his navigation of death row appeared as resistance. Resistance not as not in a sense of revolutionary resistance, but rather an assertion and reassertion of who he was. Drupad comes from a scheduled caste, which is one of the oppressed castes in India, but is more financially well off than, let's say, Purab, who comes from a forward caste but is rather poor. And Drupad's assertion of who he was in prison was to other prisoners appeared as him being a troublemaker. But to Drupad, it was a something that he said was that it's an assertion of my rights. I'm not stealing from anybody's pockets. Uh, with Datta, on the other hand, the third prisoner that we looked at, he comes from a scheduled tribe, which is an indigenous community to India. Um, he seemed to us the most obvious manifestation of the law on reformation and that the expectation of that stance. He was insistent on moving to becoming a good and ideal citizen. Uh, but he also was very insistent on erasing his past. So his movement towards reformation was coming at the cost of his own erasure and his past life, making then his transformation rather precarious. So these were the three case studies that we had, and what we realized was that when we looked at these lives through the lens of becoming, it sort of brought out the an understanding that the everyday lives of death row prisoners and it the quieter moments that they live while on death row, um, when we see that through the lens of becoming, it offers us yet another critique of not just the death penalty, but also the law in how it is developed and how it understands the lives it condemns to death. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maitri. And I think it's really important actually to see how this context and this framework can apply in other fields. So thank you very much. We continue our look outside the prison to hear next from Hargo Visling, who's going to be talking about fragmented personhood, ethical subjects with dementia in a Swiss nursing home. But before you speak, Hargo, I'm a little bit worried that we're likely to run a bit out of time for questions. So what I'm going to just say to people who are, that I think we'll have time for a little bit of questions at the end. But if people want to hang around for a little bit longer, you are very welcome to, but you're also welcome to leave when we come to the hour being up. So don't let that affect your speaking at all, Hargo. I just wanted to make that an announcement to everyone else, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'll try to be brief. I am a PhD candidate in social anthropology at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and also part of the prison research group. This paper was based on a research project where we looked at space-time regimes of care and constraint in 4 different total institutions in Switzerland. As part of the research group, I did fieldwork in 2 institutions, in prisons as well as nursing homes. And I want to just very briefly touch on the paper, and then also, because you asked us to also talk about the relevance of looking at ethics to our sites of interest, to also talk a bit about that. So the paper that I published together with you was kind of looking at how people with dementia are turned or imbued with certain kinds of personhood that allows to work with them as kind of ethical others. And therein I looked how caretakers make use of different notions or kinds of personhood. In Switzerland, as well as in other countries, nursing homes, of course, have a history of coercive confinement. So this makes it really relevant of there is a kind of an imperative to take people with dementia seriously in these contexts, because they have not for a long time. Now, what I found interesting in this is that it is up to the care workers themselves what kinds of personhood they apply. So there is this desire to treat someone ethically, but because it is the job of the care workers to apply to make them talk kind of to ethics, it results in personhood being kind of fragmented. So personhood can either be momentary, biographical, or social. And in doing so, and especially considering the institutional limits and the precarity of these institutions, very often the easiest way out is being chosen. So what happens is kind of a situation where they will take people seriously, but simultaneously they choose who these people are they take seriously from a case-to-case basis. Now, having studied both prisons and nursing homes, it would have been more obvious to talk about prisons or to write about prisons in this publication. But I was kind of intrigued by this juxtaposition and the silent irritation of talking about nursing homes in the context of confinement and in the context of prisons. I think the biggest impact that the workshop especially has had on my research and on looking at ethics for me was that you forced me to read Webb Keen and look at the ethical affordances, which I think you didn't mention in the beginning. And I really want to point out that for me, that was really very important. And I've reused this kind of notion of ethical affordance in another paper where I was looking more closely on prisons and where I tried to work out how prisons both kind of are imbued with a legal or a political intention, have social functions and very individual and violent effects. And I was trying to look at within this broader discussion on abolitionist and reformist discussions, how prison has, as an institution, very often too many justifications or goals, and how, depending on how the discussion goes, also we make use of different. So I think there's also this element of ethical affordances in these broader discussions. I think in Switzerland, we were looking at this institution and initially assumed that there would be a certain carceral turn that we could see also in nursing homes or in psychiatric hospitals. But what we found instead, or what I thought was particularly interesting, that we also saw a kind of not only a carceral turn, but also a care turn in prisons, with its own kind of precarity sneaking into prisons with this desire to care. Right. This shows very strongly in Switzerland, where since reform since 2007, there's been a renaming of wardens into caretakers. And I've been looking in another paper that is coming out soon, I hope, at the use of compassion in everyday life in prison and how compassion simultaneously creates a certain responsibilization of prisoners and the diffusion of responsibility of the prison officers, but also a certain kind of hope and agency for prisoners. And I think Professor Liebling, with reference to Moore, also talked about this tragic versus cynical approach of prison officers. And what I found was that within a very tragic disposition, there was very often a cynical message being transported as well. So that very much created an inside-outside effect. So when it came to the outside, there was a lot of compassion and acknowledgement of the structural discrimination that a lot of the prisoners faced. But when it came to the inside, it became much more cynical in the sense that very often I would hear from very compassionate caretakers, I do understand, and I do think it's unfair that you've experienced all the things that you have experienced, but now you need to work on yourself because that's the only thing that we can influence. So let's make the best of it. So put all the structural discrimination aside and let's work on you. But I think simultaneously, this hope, this agency that was allowed was crucial for a lot of the incarcerated persons I've met. So I don't know, I'm still working on it, but I think I thought it was interesting that the hidden price for this kind of hope and for surviving was also this kind of responsibility. And I think this again goes back to what we talked about in the workshops and also to this concept of the ethical affordances. Thank you.
Thank you, Hargo. That was really, really interesting. And I look forward to reading those other articles. Next, we will hear from the final empirical contribution to the themed issue, which will be Anna Jordan, talking about her article, I'm Not Allowed to Express Anything, Re-Entry and Ethical Confinement in the Shadow of California Prisons.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to kind of reiterate what other people have said today. That I was just really grateful to have found this group of people because I worked in the context of reentry, but I had also visited many prisons throughout California, and it was just, I was really interested in ethics, and that's kind of a unique intersection, and there's not too many people who are focusing on that. But then I found this group of people, and then we did this series of workshops and all of that, and it's just been a really wonderful experience. So just wanted to send my thanks for that. I did prepare a few notes that kind of talk very briefly about my article, and then I also, if there is time, have a few notes on how I see ethics as relating to my work more broadly. So my article, as I said, is based on my field work with formerly incarcerated people and ex-gang members in California in the United States, which, as many of you probably know, is one of the world's largest sites of mass incarceration, with nearly 500,000 people either incarcerated or under community supervision through things like parole and probation. And so part of what came up for me through this work was the task of connecting the institution of the prison to the ethnographic site of reentry, because in talking and getting to know these folks who were formerly incarcerated, the prison just seemed to emerge everywhere, kind of like this ghostly apparition. And so I also wanted to reach beyond some of the more material challenges that are often discussed in sociological and criminological literature, which I felt were often treated independently in these sort of neat and tidy categories, rather than within the context of, very fluid and messy lives. It's not to say that these material challenges don't matter. It is very hard to find a job. It's hard to find an apartment. Even getting a government ID, all of these things very much matter. But it seemed to me that there was a different way that we could look at them both relationally and holistically all at once. And so in the article, I focus on a case study of a man that I call Sam. And I mainly sort of dwell on the intersection between moral values and ethical freedom in moral anthropology and philosophy. So I may go a little bit farther than some of the folks here. I definitely delve into the philosophical literature a lot, which was fun, but it's definitely difficult to get through. So Sam had previously been in a gang and had been incarcerated for 16 years with a life without parole sentence. So the fact that he even got out was very lucky. He was granted clemency by the governor. And so I opened the article with a story where we were sitting outside having coffee in a park. And in talking about his early experiences with reentry, I think at this point he had been out only 2 months or something. He said that people often interject how you're supposed to feel. They say, well, didn't you just get out? Aren't you super happy? And for him, he told me, yeah, but can I have both? And what he's referring to is like, can I also talk about, what criminologists call the pains of reentry, the difficulties? Can't he both be grateful and also have these frustrations or challenges in his life? And so this is like seemingly very mundane, but for me, it actually became the crux of a kind of moral conflict that Sam and many of the other people I worked with experienced. And ultimately, what I saw it doing is sort of functioning as a kind of extended confinement, where people are sort of trapped in this liminal moral space of good and not good, and they're not really accepted into normative ethical citizenship in that way. They're kind of held at bay always. And so I call this ethical liminality, and I talk about it as this sort of suspended moral animation, where the articulation of these hegemonic moral values in everyday life come to impinge upon people in confining ways, in that their meaning is inevitably tied up with their history of incarceration and carceral control. And so for Sam, this always came up in terms of power dynamics. So people in cities in, sort of regular clothes were always associated with prison staff, and they have to be obeyed, let alone people who might be in uniform. And so when somebody tells him, aren't you just super grateful, for him, it sort of becomes this demand to perform a kind of gratitude that is sort of uncompromising and just very, very specific. And in doing so, it kind of I argue it kind of recapitulates these carceral power dynamics. And in doing so, it constitutes a form of ethical unfreedom and extended carceral control. And so for Sam, the moral value of gratitude actually hinders or restricts his ability to pursue a moral life, and even, moral self-identity, to sort of continually work on his sense of self and what it means to be a good person. Because the way that gratitude is indexed in everyday life and in these mundane conversations is in this sort of unilateral, uncompromising way, which eschews any other form of nuanced subjectivity. And for Sam, this nuanced subjectivity is not just about complaining or something like that. It's actually just expressing vulnerability. So for him, vulnerability serves as a sort of foundational aspect of what he considers to be a good person for living a good life. Because for him, vulnerability goes against everything that he's associated with criminality. Like in gangs, these sort of like rough and tumble masculinity, you don't sort of share your feelings, except in very specific circumstances. And so being sort of having this expectation placed on him to be grateful in this uncompromising way meant that he wasn't able to work on himself in this sort of core trait of vulnerability, which was sort of the bedrock for him of a moral identity. And then I'll just say very briefly, beyond this, I feel like ethics was not just a theoretical lens through which I could sort of view these less material challenges of, how the prison sort of appears in the context of reentry, but it was also a thread that connects those sort of threads of power, those penal logics, all the way down to the individual level of experience. So I could kind of look at everything, every sort of level, the prison, the institution, these wider cultural discourses, all the way through, rehabilitation discourses inside of prison and the moral conflicts that those sort of produce, and then all the way down to the individual and their phenomenological subjective experience. And so it was a way to sort of connect all of those threads together, even in the context of reentry, where the prison may not sort of readily present itself, but it is always there. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. That's a great summary of what we hope the perspective can do. And last, but by no means least, we'll hear from Alison Liebling, who's going to talk about her very generous epilogue to the themed issue.
Thank you, Alice. And Ryan, I'm just going to be generous again and say how wonderful it was to be part of this project. I mean, to be at the workshop, but then to watch the papers develop, to have an opportunity to read them, and to get excited about this whole territory. And so I'm really pleased with the special issue. I think I point a lot of people towards it, and I think it's a really great piece of work. So, I mean, all I wanted to do was kind of reflect with you as a group on a couple of things. The first was, you've said a few times that so I guess I'm thinking, what kind of a project is this? And sometimes you're introducing it as looking at the world through ethics or morality, and that makes me aware that that's not what got me here. What got me here was looking at the world through phenomenology and experience, and it was the person.
Good morning. Good morning.
That led me to
Brian, as host, can you mute? I can't mute, but can you mute, please? Sorry.
So,
Alison.
That's all right. So something about if experience is value laden, then looking at personhood and starting from there is what leads us to morality. That's been kind of my journey. So it feels, I'm asking the question, does it make a difference whether that's where we start? Do we need to start there, or actually is it something else about our research methods and approach to social science and who we think human beings are that naturally leads us to value-laden experience. But the other thing, which I think is a huge part of your project, is that it feels that this topic enables a kind of critical analysis of punishment practices and theory. And I describe current models of punishment as a kind of self-sabotage. Once we connect up the sort of theory of punishment with the real experience, it feels like this, from my point of view, is one of the most exciting things that's going on in our field at the moment. I think it changes, it sort of breaks down the separation between those two fields and gives us huge potential in both directions to just think much more critically about what this punishment thing is. And I think that's also a huge part of your project. And then my final comment was, I noticed when I looked at that postscript or epilogue, I refer to Rousseau having a bit of an existential crisis and then landing on moral theory. And I think that's been part of my journey, that what's got me here is my own moral discomfort, which grew, uncontrollably the longer I spent researching prisons and the longer I was able to witness periods of reform and then reversals of that reform, the more I had to ask myself, what am I doing here? Like, why am I researching this? And I have finally written my big book on this topic, where I've tried to reflect on my own prisons research life and its meaning. And it's taken me outside of prisons, because it feels like that's kind of what this topic is doing. It's helping us to get closer to the value-laden experience of individuals, think more critically about punishment, but also connect those layers up to some of the things that are going on in our communities, the things that have been referred to already. So those are my thoughts, but the main one is great project. And it's really nice that now it appears as a whole issue. So well done, you two.
Thank you so much, Alison. That's very kind of you, and also a really useful bridge into a kind of question and answer section. So as I said earlier, we are now already over time, so apologies about that. We were trying to fit quite a lot in. So if people have other places to be, that I'll include the speakers on that. I know for some of you it's strange times of day. By all means, feel free to leave, but I've got time to stay for a bit, and if anyone's got time to stay for a bit, that would be fun too. Maybe kind of 15-20 minutes of conversation, I think, would be really interesting, but no shade to anyone who's got something else to do. And we could start perhaps with Alison's questions, thoughts, comments, but also other people, please do post things in the chat or raise hands. I have one thought on one of your comments, Alison, and then I'll see if other people here do, which is, what kind of project is this? Are we looking at the world through morality or through personhood? Or is there something about who human beings are that naturally lead us to values? And my answer to that is yes. I think for me, that's how I got there as well. That I think to think of us without values, to think of people as people without values or without ethics is a diminished way of looking at the world. So I think the two come together, So I think I'm calling for better attention to the world through ethics and morality because of the type of people we all are. I don't know if that's what other speakers would think. I don't know if they have different answers, or if they want to address other things that you've said, or if indeed there are other questions. So I'll open the floor.
I would just say that I would second that. That was something that I was thinking about earlier this morning too. That for me, it wasn't so much about applying some kind of theory to a particular context. It's the fact that the prison itself is, it is literally and symbolically, the material form of morality in a particular society, right? It's a thing that stands as the and all the laws and stuff. But what I found, I guess, really interesting and also heartbreaking in a way too, was not just that there was this, the capital M morality that Ryan and Alice talk about, but all of these sort of contradictions that occur within the prison and outside of it too, and in spaces that I've looked at elsewhere in terms of like rehabilitation discourses, where you're kind of once a criminal, always a criminal, confessional discourses in parole hearings, things like that. And so it really is just everywhere. And then with the people that I got to know and worked with, those were the things that they were just inherently most concerned about. What does it mean to be a good person? How do you deal with this long-lasting shame and guilt, especially since the folks I worked with had been in prison for very long periods of time. The US is very good at that, for better or for worse. So Sam by no means was alone. I worked with folks who were imprisoned for 24 years, 25, or even 40 years. And so really morality was their primary concern. The material challenges did matter, and you could also call it trauma, all of these different things that people shoulder psychologically and emotionally. But I think the thing that tied it all together and the thing that was most fundamental, sort of at the core of it, was ethics and morality.
Donna, does anyone have other reflections on Alison's comments, or indeed other questions for any of the contributors?
Maybe, Alice, just to give people time to think, that when you were back, and I loved Anna's summary there, perhaps also starting with, it feels a bit to me as if you're being a bit deferential to moral anthropology in this project also, because lots of us got here without moral anthropology, and we might have stumbled across it on our journeys. But I think people are coming to this conclusion from the background of lawyers working in real practice, and lots of different routes. So I don't know. I was only thinking that when you said it, but I wonder whether that's necessary to sort of base this development in what was going on a little bit before that in moral anthropology, or whether actually we'd have found our way here anyway, just because of what's there. It's because it's in people and it's in the world. Or whether there is a moral turn in social science and what that signifies. But I don't think you have to sort of credit moral anthropology for the journeys that you're all going on, particularly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Ryan?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it was a convenient base for us to frame the special issue. But I think absolutely the questions that they've been asking are certainly interdisciplinary, and yeah, I definitely think it's more open than that. We wouldn't want to. It was very convenient for the special issue just to say, here's some texts, here's how we frame the problem, and let's see where it goes with it. But we certainly don't want to bind it down to those texts, but certainly bringing more in would be great.
Hage.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you said about connecting the theory of punishment to the actual experience. And I don't know, for me, it was always kind of this passing from the outside to the inside was always a weird feeling, kind of, because I don't know, whenever I talked inside prison, I tried to ask people about what they thought about rehabilitation. I would get laughed at. And in many ways, it felt to me like, I mean, prison very often, or someone described it to me as a kind of very expensive theater that the audience is not meant to see. And I don't know, I don't know how this connecting works, because I don't know if you share this feeling, but prisons, if they weren't this harmful, would be ridiculous institutions, kind of, once you look at them from the inside. And there's very different, they seem to change shape they seem to change their shape depending on whether you look at them from the inside or the outside, right? So for me, this connecting this theory of punishment to the actual experience, for me, it's even hard to connecting the idea of prison, looking at it from the outside, to connecting what happens on the inside, because it's so completely different. And And yeah, it does not connect somehow, right? I don't know if that makes any sense, just a thought.
It makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That's really interesting. Julianne, do you want to?
Yeah, so I feel that, so I'm saying this as an anthropologist, not an anthropologist of ethics. I've never identified myself as such, but I feel that something that might, so because this is also, I guess, also theological, also a philosophical, like the question of moral and ethics is something that is age old, right? And what this volume to me kind of contributes is how do we approach this, right? So how do we start to see this also in this context, a context that has, I guess, from its inception, really presented itself as a moral project, but somehow that side of it has kind of not been the attention of those approaching prisons empirically, or spaces, of course, of confinement empirically. And so I think what is perhaps a very interesting, what brings us together in a way is also kind of, we have been approaching this empirically because the empirical side of it has pushed it on to us, right? So the experience and the things people say inside prison has pushed it on to us. So from the inside out. And I think that there's something quite interesting going on there in terms of method, right? So these one-person cases, but we're not psychologists. So maybe some people would say like, but how can you do that, right? If you're not going at it in this level, and we're kind of showing, but we can, right? There is a way in which we can approach and research morality and ethics in these environments. Yeah, beyond a kind of individualist approach of individual redemption or individual pathologization or this kind of thing, but also how we can look at that through, yeah, broader kind of political and social configurations that are at play and at stake. I don't know if I'm making sense anymore, but I just wanted to add to that I think also methodologically there's something going on here that is worthwhile kind of drawing out.
Thanks, Julian. That's super interesting. Ben Jarman has posted an interesting question in the chat, which I think relates to some of what has been talked about. So how can we connect what we see about the ethical lives of people in confinement, especially prisons, with the ethical discourses about punishment in the world outside? So I guess he's wondering about whether any of this approach can contribute to better politics around punishment, which I think relates to some of what Alison was saying, some of what Hagar was saying, some of what Julian was saying. And when you made that point, so I'll give people a chance to think about what their answer to is, and I'll just say what I was thinking in the meantime. That as when you made your point, Alison, about the kind of push towards questioning punishment within prisons and how that's an interesting development within the prison sociology field, I was quite conscious that I've been involved in some of that work too, and I'll often think I'm doing something differently if am I doing a kind of more anthropology of ethics style paper, or am I doing a more penal theories of punishment style paper? And that's curious to know why that is. Some of it is just starting with different literatures, and some of it is starting in slightly different perspectives, slightly different angles of looking in the prison. I think part of what makes this themed issue specific is its inside focus, and I think the studies of punishment are valuable. The work on punishment is valuable and also encourages an ethical framework, but it does often start more from the outside. So what role is this playing within, what role is punishment or this punishing institution playing within society, and so on. And I think there are ways in which I think the kind of detailed empirical critiques that we can make using some of the stuff from this framework can I hope contribute to broader criticisms around punishment, critiques around punishment. The two contributions from this themed issue that stand out to me as doing that are Maitreys and Zabers, and also Julie's and Christian's, but I'm sure others do as well. But yes, and coincidentally, both Julie and Maitreyi have hands up, so I'll let you speak. Do you want to go first? Because I think you're showing us speaking first on my screen.
Oh, Thank you. It's very brief, actually. I was just wondering whether what it is we're trying to do is both sort of grasp onto to people's sort of moral confusion in a way. So I think what Peter, the quote from Peter we use partly of what I think he was saying was, this is so confusing. I do not understand what, what, who am I for having done this, for being punished, and then sort of seeking clarity by, or I mean, not by his own free will entering the institution, but a bit actually, because he was sort of prepared to be punished and corrected, for lack of a better word, but was utterly confused when he arrived there. So I think that moral confusion is probably, so like I think Hago is what you're saying was really interesting, that the prison looks, it looks like it's something and then it's something completely different. But I think sometimes people should be more morally confused about what a prison is, and they're not confused enough. So maybe our job is, or job, our what this framework enable us to do is to sort of grasp the ungraspable, or and to use an Allison expression, to get the description right of that, of all the messy stuff, so people can be more confused. Maybe, yeah, that's my Friday afternoon take.
Not a confusing contribution, but a valuable contribution. Matri.
Yeah, no, I was both to Ben's question and maybe what Alison uh, asked us to think about punishments and bringing it out and connecting it to multiple things that we find in our daily work or research. Um, I I think, at least the way I've understood how punishments work, is that they seem to be quite different from what the actual experience is, yes. And I think part of the reason is that the idea of punishment itself is quite patronizing. Um, and it automatically both others the individual, diminishes them to a child, and it creates out of them something that they are not. They are adults who have made mistakes, but it's somehow being treated as you're a child who needs, whether it's the language of reform and the correction, or whether deservedness. Uh, it and, and and also the fact that a lot of uh, philosophizing and theorizing about punishment happens without people who have gone through any kind of punishment, or at least incarceration. Um, and and so, like in law, for instance, we'd say that the best laws might be those which are made by the affected community, or the community that is potentially going to be affected by it. And I don't think in theorizing we offer the same canvas or framing, that theorizing about punishment, what its goals should be, what its goals can be, should we have punishment, seem to come from people who think they know what the right way of life is, or should be. And I think that's where everything starts falling apart. So yeah, I don't know if that made sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's kind of thinking about different kind of frameworks or ways of thinking about morality, that kind of a lot of theorizing about punishment comes from a very top-down way of thinking about morality, one that's kind of a Bernard Williams morality system style way of thinking about morality. This is what is right, this is what is wrong, this is what you have to do, and that actually we need to recognize that the world is much more confusing than that, to use Julie's phrase. Christian, and then Ryan.
Thank you. This was a really interesting session overall, and also conversation now towards the end. But my question / comment is about your second point, Alison, about this turn to ethics, allowing for new forms of critique, and and I guess I'm wondering what you mean by offering a new route for critique, because So is it the basic fact that if this kind of approach allows us to say that unethical, unmoral people that we have put in prison do have serious moral concerns, and they have their ethical and moral projects going on, but you could make the case that this is a kind of censorious critique that can come out of this emphasis, because you prisoners are basically saying, we do have some moral projects going on, but we are trying to accomplish them in institutions that really makes it hard for us to accomplish these moral projects. And so I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's at least, it might be one kind of route for a new kind of critique. And Thomas Mathisen wrote that, the kind of the censorious critique that he found among prisoners in the prison he studied in the 60s was actually an efficient one. And I think that's perhaps a bit overlooked, that, he kind of made the argument that the Sykes form of resistance is kind of perhaps romanticized, but not very efficient. But the kind of the more depressive censorious critique actually, might be more efficient. Yeah.
Shall I reply to that?
Yes.
That's great, Christian. It's not what I meant, but you've made me think, which is always good. And I think what you've just said should be taken very seriously. I think what I had in mind was the things that other people have touched on, which is this lack of connection between the inside and the outside, that you wouldn't recognize. Prisoners even go to prison and then are completely confused, because even their own understanding of prison and punishment is suddenly shattered. They thought they might get help, or I might get my head sorted out, or something might be, in Jonathan Jacobs' words, morally intelligible, and actually this just doesn't make sense. So I start my book with a prisoner who says, "It don't make no sense, Alison." And what doesn't make sense is the very concept of the human being on which punishment is premised doesn't make sense. So it's sort of that the critique is the distance. It's what Diego was talking about, and it's that there isn't any reflection of the theories that are going on outside in the prison experience, that they just don't connect. And I think that means you can come back outside from inside the prison, and we should probably be going in and out in our analyses much more, and just say whatever it is we say, that if we think punishment is about keeping how we live together, this is not helping us live together. It's making it harder for us to live together. So I think the critique is really a critique outward of our naivety about the prison as an institution. We expect so much of it, and it just does not fulfill any of those aspirations.
There's a comment, some questions, so maybe I'll just be very brief with mine, Alice.
Yeah, go for it.
I was building off of what Ben was saying here, thinking about ethical discourses about punishment, but I also couldn't do it in this piece, but reflecting more broadly on ethical discourses about the human. Who is human, who qualifies as being human? Obviously, that's quite integral to punishment. When people do certain acts, they become less human, they become subhuman. But also, who is human, who is not human, is obviously part of racial experience. And we've been talking about prisoners as though they're static units, but they're not. They don't experience punishment all the same. They don't have the same discourses applied to them. And I think that's bubbling under the surface of my paper, but I obviously couldn't build on that. But just thinking about what are the discourses of the human and its limits, the limitations we put around those discourses of who qualifies as being human. And for this work, I'm quite inspired by Alexander Wahilie's work, and looking at people who are human or not quite human or less than human. So just adding that racialized dimension to it. And then that actually folds into critique, which is also what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna, having said that we were going to go over, I'm going to draw things to a close shortly, but I did want to acknowledge Bev's question in the chat. So we'll end with that if that's all right, because I feel like going over by half an hour is about as long as it is permissible to do. But I thought Bev had a fantastic question. First, from a moral psychological or political psychological lens, what are the risks of this moral framing for justice reform, and how do we distinguish moral transformation from moral compliance? I think that is a really difficult question, and I think it gets to this point about the importance of complexity. And I think this is an area where, at least in my jurisdiction, my academic world, the UK, I work in a UK university, there's a big push to kind of be, outward focusing and doing impact work. And I feel like this is a conversation that we need to sort out as academics first before we can do that. I feel like there would be a risk in taking this work as it currently is to the prison service and saying we're interested in moral lies, because I think we need to get our thinking straight before we can jump too simplistically to kind of trying to change the system. I think that's part of what's going on here. The second question, which I'll direct to Anna, and then I think I'll let it all go, is that in your paper, gratitude becomes both a virtue and a burden. Can we think of moral gratitude as a kind of emotional governance that extends the carceral state into everyday relationships?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll try to be very quick. Yes. And I think that's something that I try to argue in the paper, is that it is, I guess I call it sort of moral in this sort of like extended carceral control. But I also am sort of viewing moral as something that encompasses like psychosocial emotional experience in that way. So absolutely. And then, yeah, to the point, I guess I would also agree with Alice about, being very careful. I think one of the things I try to do in my wider work is sort of point out some of the contradictions and hypocrisies in some of the moral discourses that are perpetuated by the prison. But it is a very difficult line to toe. And I was fortunate enough to be working in the context of reentry. When I was trying to do this inside the prisons, then there's a whole nother sort of political authority that you're dealing with, and there's always the chance that they could then take it and misuse it, or anything like that. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Anna. I will draw things to a close here, but just want to end by saying thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you in particular to the authors for your amazing contributions. And thank you also for your discussions today. I had thought of this as a nice way of wrapping up this nice project, but this discussion going the way it's gone has made me think, oh, maybe we should do more. Maybe what we need to do is work out how this, there's a phrase Alison used that I wrote down, what this framing, what this way of thinking about the human being, how this challenges the ways in which our concepts of punishment are based. Maybe that is the next step. I don't know, watch this space, but it feels like there are more unanswered questions than I thought there were. But yes, thank you all very much for coming. Yes, let's do that, Anna. And take care and have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.